The dollar you keep in your pocket is actually a false promise. Its mystery is over 100 years old, and this hidden file will open your eyes. In 1933, if you owned gold, you could be considered a criminal. Why? Because America was bound by an invisible chain. Today, we will reveal how America's greatest power, the power to print money, was handed over to a handful of private bankers, and how they silently stole the wealth of the nation's citizens and turned the dollar into a massive burden of debt. This is the hidden file of the golden chain, the story of the chain that still binds America today.
Let's go. When you think of a country's hidden secrets, you might imagine some old chest or forgotten diary of presidents. But in America's history, there is a real conspiracy hidden in the most ordinary thing, right inside the paper dollars in your wallet. This is not fiction. It is the story of an economic and political revolution that began at the start of the last century and continues to control the fate of ordinary Americans even today. The story begins in 1913, just before Christmas, when most politicians were heading home for the holidays. A law was rushed through Congress, the Federal Reserve Act. This law established a central banking system in America called the Federal Reserve, or Fed. Normally, a nation's central bank is fully controlled by its government. But when the Federal Reserve was created, it was essentially a consortium of private banks. The law was passed so secretly and so quickly that its foundation had actually been laid 3 years earlier. In 1910, America's most influential bankers, representatives of J.P. Morgan, the Rothschilds, and the Rockefellers, secretly gathered on Jekyll Island in Georgia. They traveled under disguise and swore not to use their real names. From this highly confidential meeting, the blueprint for America's central banking system was created.
Through this new system, the Federal Reserve was given exclusive authority to print America's dollars, meaning the U.S. government no longer printed money for itself. Instead, it borrowed money from the Federal Reserve, giving government bonds in return. As a result, every dollar printed in America was essentially a loan. This meant that from birth, the dollar was tied to interest, backed not by real assets, but by the government's promise of debt. The government handed over its most important power, control over the nation's money, to a semi-private institution. After the Federal Reserve was created, the U.S. was still under a monetary system called the Gold Standard. Under this system, every dollar was backed by a specific amount of gold. You could exchange your dollars directly for gold at any time. This gold was the dollar's true value. But World War I, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the expenses of subsequent wars drained America's treasury. The government realized that to stimulate the economy and pay for the wars, it needed to print more money. But the gold standard restricted them because they didn't have enough gold to match the amount of dollars they needed. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, came to power. Under the pretext of combating the Great Depression, he issued a groundbreaking and controversial order, Executive Order 6102. Through this order, all privately held gold in America was confiscated. Citizens were ordered to surrender all their gold, coins, bullion, to the Federal Reserve. Violating this order could result in 10 years in prison. This was an unprecedented act of property seizure in American history. After the government seized gold from the people, the official gold price was raised from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the value of the gold in the government's vaults increased by nearly 70%. This additional value gave the government the power to combat the Depression and fund new projects. But its deeper political meaning was this: the government stripped citizens of their ultimate economic security, their control over gold. From then on, citizens had no direct control over the value of the dollar.
Once America secured its control over gold, it aimed to turn the dollar into a global currency. In 1944,
Near the end of World War II, representatives of 44 Allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their decision was historic and would define America's future. The U.S. dollar would become the standard for global trade. This agreement was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Its core idea was this: other world currencies would be tied to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the dollar itself could be converted into gold at the rate of $35 per ounce. This meant that foreign central banks could take their dollar reserves and directly demand gold from the U.S. Treasury. America promised to provide this gold. This system gave America unprecedented economic power. Since global trade, especially oil trade, the petrodollar system, was conducted in dollars, the demand for dollars skyrocketed. But the system was a delicate trap for America. Over time, as the U.S. printed more and more money to fund expenses like the Vietnam War, other nations realized the U.S. didn't have enough gold to back all the dollars in circulation. America's promise was becoming fragile. Finally came the breaking point. August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon, in a televised speech, announced, "I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." This event became known as the Nixon Shock. Though described as a temporary suspension, it was effectively a permanent declaration that the dollar was no longer tied to gold. Nixon had ended the Bretton Woods Agreement and turned the dollar into the world's first true fiat currency, a currency with no intrinsic value. Its worth now depended only on government promise. As a result, the dollar completely lost its gold backing. America could now print unlimited money to pay its debts, leading to rising inflation and a growing national debt.
We have now reached the point where this historical hidden file directly affects America today. Since 1971, the dollar has had no physical asset to anchor its value. The Federal Reserve now controls interest rates and prints money, often creating economic bubbles and inflation instead of stability. The most hidden truth of this story is this: inflation is a silent way of stealing people's savings. Once the golden chain was broken, the more money the government printed, the less each dollar was worth. Since 1913, the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen by about 96%, meaning what $1 could buy in 1913 is now worth only around 4 cents. This silent devaluation happened without the public even noticing. And since the government can now print money freely, America's national debt has soared to unimaginable levels. This burden ultimately falls on every American citizen who pays the interest on this debt through their taxes. Thus, America's financial history is not a dry economic theory. It is the story of a systematic capture of power, step by step, silently, from 1913 to 1971. The core of this hidden file is this: despite being the symbol of democracy, America handed over control of its financial system to a semi-private banking syndicate. By confiscating gold and freeing the dollar from the golden chain, they turned the currency into a debt-based system. America's greatest secret, its financial independence, is hidden inside the paper note handed to its people. It is a timeless warning, still relevant today. If this hidden file opened your eyes, like the video and share it so others can discover this truth. And stay tuned. Soon we will reveal another hidden file: how the U.S. government is secretly trying to control gold and cryptocurrency. Subscribe to Hidden File HQ.